We should be recording now. I think we have 12 o'clock. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Family Business Friday. As you know, we try to start at 12 noon and end promptly around 1 p.m. We're honored to have some experts from the Saiber attorneys at law, DanaLynn Colao, Amy Foger, and Paola Hemsley. And just wonderful experts. As always, I like to begin with just kind of an overview of who we are at Rothman and kind of where we are. So our mission is to support, promote, and research entrepreneurship with a special focus on family and veteran businesses. We wouldn't exist without our foundations for our family business program, the TD Bank Charitable Foundation, Provident Bank, Sun Trust, CIA&J, and a number of other smaller sponsors. The programs that we've had include our student entrepreneurship program. The Institute's been around about 30 years. I teach a course called Family Business Management, but we also have University Pitch program to help student entrepreneurs at the university and also participate in the statewide competition. We have a Family Business Alliance. It's been around 30 years where we have membership and we have a peer-to-peer coaching session and a number of different programs that will get back to be in person once we're all back. Our Family Business Awards, our 28th year is coming up where we honor the best family businesses in New Jersey under 10 million and over 10 million. So that's in October, the fourth Wednesday in October every year. We have a program called Veterans Launching Ventures. Our newest one is starting next Tuesday. It's a national program. We have people from, I think, about 8 or 9 different states, really helping individuals who are veterans or immediate family members develop a business plan and really help their business be successful. And then we have a small business series with experts talking about what it's like and what small businesses are dealing with. One of the things that we recently started was something called Family Business Week, which is the 4th week in October every year. And the whole idea is for people to identify and support a family business. We want them to do it every day of the year, but to give a special week so that people can begin to do that. And our website is familybusinessweek.com. We've also done something called Shop Family and J to allow people to buy gift cards for businesses, especially at restaurants and others that have been closed for the better part of 3 or 4 months. We have a YouTube channel that we really have been building out. This video and others will be on our Rothman Institute of Entrepreneurship channel. People often confuse us with the Rothman Institute that does orthopedic stuff. I've had many people come and say, hey, you guys did my knee. So unfortunately we didn't. We're focused on the entrepreneurship out of Fairleigh Dickinson University. One of the things, I have a TV show called Family Business World, which is streamed on RVN TV every Thursday at 10 a.m. and 8 p.m. And the whole idea is I interview family businesses. If you have some good family businesses, let us know. We'd love to talk to them. And really celebrating family businesses and talking about some of the challenges that they face. We also have experts on the show who can talk about, who work with family businesses so that people can learn. And then obviously this weekly show that we started immediately after the crisis that we expect to continue throughout the year. So because of all that, I have the opportunity of being on the New Jersey Restart and Recovery Advisory Council. We have meetings every Friday. We had one this morning, so I get an advanced look at where the governor is going. And so the good news is it looks like things are really going to be opening up fairly soon, but they're really pushing this idea of wearing masks everywhere you go outside of your house. I think we're close to getting back to what I call a new normal, except with masks. And so, again, hopefully this sign will go the way of the dodo bird. We won't see too much of this soon, but one of the things that's important, and I always show this every session, and I know many of you who are regulars or have seen this, is that you look at the 2009-2010 crisis, and you had unemployment about 700,000. Now with this crisis, you're looking at unemployment, upwards of almost 40 million now, and this is a few weeks old. And so why is that? It's really because small businesses are the economy, and that's where the jobs are. And the small businesses weren't hurt as much in 2009, 2010 it was more a big business crisis. And you look at the breakdown, almost 70% of the businesses are under 100 employees, 20% under 500, and 10% are big businesses. So with that, I want to turn it over to the experts we have from Saiber, and I will stop sharing and we'll let, I guess, DanaLynn, you'll share.
Thank you.
Perfect.
Okay. Well, good afternoon, everyone. It is a pleasure to be here and have the opportunity to speak with all of you. As Dale said, I am an attorney with Saiber, as are my colleagues, Ami and Paola. Saiber is a full-service law firm. We provide legal services to large companies and small family businesses, public and private entities in a variety of industries. And we provide support in all areas of law, banking, corporate law, real estate, trademarks, copyright, general commercial matters, as well as, of course, labor and employment. Today,
Could you make that full screen? Could you put it to the full screen?
Sure. I can try.
Full screen, yep. This button here, I think.
If you click enable editing, and then that that kind of like TV type screen at the bottom of your screen should hopefully do it for you. Right next to the scroll line to the left.
I'm sorry, I'm not seeing it.
See the enable, yeah, enable editing. If you can do enable editing, click on that.
I know I don't see that option. I'm sorry.
At the top of your screen, it says enable editing, protected view.
It doesn't. It just says screen sharing.
Okay. Well, all right. If you can advance, we'll work with that.
My apologies.
No problem.
So as I was saying, we're here today to give you guys some general guidance and help you to try to navigate some of the challenges that employers are facing during these unprecedented times. As you all know, as employers, OSHA requires that you provide a safe workplace for your employees, and to do so, you know, there are a lot of considerations that must be kept in mind. The failure to maintain a safe workplace and provide a safe workplace could subject you to liability under OSHA. And we have, in fact, seen rises in OSHA claims just since this pandemic began. So one of the very first things that you'll need is a plan, right? So you need a back to business plan. And this is one of those things that I'm sure you're all been thinking about. And I encourage you to take sufficient time to put together a comprehensive plan. Each one of your workplaces is unique and different. So there is not an exact science on exactly how your plan should look or what it should include. I do encourage you to try to be strategic and flexible in developing the plan. But by that, I mean considering hypothetical situations that may arise in your workplace that will help you to plan accordingly. So again, you know what will likely come up in your workplace, what your customers' needs may be, and your employees. So think through those situations and try to plan accordingly to make sure that everyone is safe. It's also important to be flexible and open-minded. You may need to consider concepts and procedures that in the past you may not have been willing to do. And for that reason, you know, you might want to adjust your typical working hours. You may need to adjust your hygiene protocol and even your dress code, or perhaps, you know, allowing people to work from home that in the past you really would have preferred to be in the office. In your plan, there's going to be some very basic things that I think all plans will need to include, as well as a importance on communication, which we think is also critical to ensure that your plan can succeed. So what are some of those basics that we think all of your plans should include? First, you'll want to establish immediate steps to quarantine any employees that either have symptoms of COVID-19, test positive, or perhaps have had contact with someone that has tested positive for COVID.
I think we're still on the title screen here.
You are? I'm moving.
Should I try sharing my screen? I can maybe run, if there's a technical issue on your end, would that help?
Sure, that's fine. I'll stop sharing. I apologize, everyone.
No problem.
Okay, let me see if this helps. No guarantee that I'll do better, but I'll try. There we go. Is this the right screen?
Yes, it is.
Okay, I'll try. If I fall behind, just let me know.
Okay, thank you so much, Ami. I apologize, Dale, and to all the attendees.
No problem. No problem.
Okay, so as I was saying, all of your plans, you'll need to establish some protocol for quarantining employees that either test positive or exposed to someone that tests positive or maybe just exhibit symptoms. And we recognize that that certainly is disruptive to your business, but the failure to separate such individuals from your other employees will only likely lead to the further spread of the virus, and that will be only further disruption to your business. All plans should have some sort of screening perhaps done for employees when they arrive each day or before they even arrive, as well as for visitors. In addition, you'll want to have social distancing measures in place. You'll have your employees and your visitors wearing masks and other potentially protective equipment. You'll want to enhance your cleaning and sanitation procedures in the workplace, as well as restrict the use of shared equipment and workspaces. You'll want to implement hygiene requirements, including hand washing and sanitizing. And then, of course, you're going to need to educate your employees and your visitors on these safety procedures. I know I just walked through those kind of quickly, but we're going to continue talking about them throughout the program. I want to emphasize at the outset the importance of clearly communicating with your employees. There is almost nothing more important, quite frankly, maybe than wearing the mask, but you really need to make sure that you provide information to your employees and make sure they understand what they can expect when they return to the workplace. Providing them with as much advance notice as possible will be greatly appreciated by your employees, who really will need to adapt their personal lives and whatever else might be going on in their homes, given now that we're approaching the summer. Those that have children may or may not be going to camp. We're still on the clearly communicate slide with employees.
Oops.
Okay, thank you. You'll also want to make sure you're communicating with your employees about what safety protocols you'll be implementing. They want to know that they're going to come to work and they're going to be safe for themselves, and that they will be returning home in a safe manner to their families. In making sure that you communicate with your employees will help to maybe address some anxiety that some employees may have about returning to the workplace. So it's really important that you take that extra time to communicate very clearly with your employees. Tell them exactly what preventative steps you're taking, as well as the expectations that you have for your employees. Make sure that they understand that when they come into the workplace, that things will be different. It will not be, quote, business as usual. There will be expectations on those employees to keep in mind the social distancing as well as hygiene requirements, and that will be a new condition of their employment, and that there's an expectation that all employees will follow, because if not everyone follows the rules, it's going to be those one or two people that break the chain, and that's where we'll see an increase in risk. So clearly communicating those expectations is paramount. And then, of course, there will be questions, as there should be, and we want to encourage our employees to come forward with questions. And in doing so, I would suggest that you designate one person, maybe two, depending upon the size of your organization, to answer those questions. It's important that there be a consistent message that's communicated. And if you limit the number of people that are answering those questions, you'll stand a greater chance of making sure that accurate and consistent information is communicated to your employees and there's no confusion. Next slide. So let's talk about returning employees to the workplace. So, some of you may have been having some employees continue to come to your workplace and others may have been completely shut down. Either way, you're definitely going to be entering a new phase, and there's a lot of different ways to approach the situation. As we've seen the governor articulate, a phased approach to this pandemic seems to make a lot of sense and to be working for us right now. So I would encourage you as employers to also consider a phased approach. Even as these orders, roll out and new protocol seems to be approved by the governor, it doesn't necessarily mean that we should all be rushing back into the office at the same time. A lot of our clients are taking a really slow step-by-step approach and are slowly planning to return people to the workplace only as they feel it's necessary. So going forward, a lot of our clients are not returning their employees to the workplace for several months to come. They feel like they've been able to operate in a productive way, and they don't feel the need to increase the risk right now. You may feel differently depending upon the nature of your business, but I would encourage you to be selective in who it is that you bring back to the office, how many people, and be careful in selecting those people. Make sure that the reason that you're selecting Mary over John is because Mary has a skill that needs to be performed or can be better performed in the office. Make sure you're not including any discriminatory criteria in the selection of individuals. I'm sure none of you would intentionally do so, but even just, being mindful that if it turns out that you have 50 employees at home and you decide to bring back in 15 of them, are they all men? Are they all women? Was that a consideration in your decision making? Were you careful to make sure that you weren't discriminating in selecting people that you thought were healthier or didn't have health issues? You don't want to be accused of discriminating against people because of disabilities or perceived disabilities. So you just need to be a little bit careful when you're going through that selection process and gradually returning your employees to the workplace. And then I encourage you all, as I said a moment ago, to continue the idea of teleworking. I know that not everyone was a big fan of teleworking at the outset of this pandemic, but a lot of us have learned that some of our employees can do their job just as well at home. So maybe we want to minimize how many people we bring back and keep those that we can working remotely. Next slide. Okay, so let's talk about social distancing measures, right? That's all we're hearing about is as long as we're all socially distant, that's how we can reduce risk. Well, the very first thing about social distancing will be to have a written policy. We would all agree that making sure everybody clearly understands what social distancing measures are being implemented in your workplace warrants a written policy. It's not enough to just simply tell people. We want to have a document in place that lays it all out. You're asking people to completely change how they've operated in your workplace. Maybe some of your employees have been there for 10 years, and now you're asking them to do something completely different. So having a written policy in place that's very clear, and that is a resource for your employees so that they can go back and look at it later should they have any questions, I think is an excellent idea. You're going to want to consider maybe even changing your work schedules, not having everybody come in on the same days, or maybe having people start and stop at different times. There's been a lot of discussion about minimizing crowds of people all coming into a building at once and all leaving at once. Probably a good idea to speak with the other tenants in your building if you're in a shared space like that, and see if you can coordinate with your neighbors. We have that in our own office, and people have been very receptive to trying to work things out so that there aren't, 100 or 200 people coming at the same time. In that same vein, you may also want to designate lunch times, stagger them, which is something, again, you may not have ever wanted to do before, but in these unprecedented times, something you might want to open your mind up to. You're going to want to establish limits on in-person meetings and events. So you want to, suggest that people stay in their own workspaces when communicating even with a colleague in the office rather than physically going to their office or hovering over their workstation. You're going to want to continue to encourage these video conferences with clients and customers rather than in-person meetings. And then you're going to want to limit, events that people may attend. And although right now there aren't that many being scheduled, they will start to happen. And when they do, I would still encourage you to be cautious about sending your employees to large gatherings. Of course, you're going to want to prohibit physical contact in the office. So that would be handshakes or fist pumps or even elbow pumps, hugging, of course. Some employees might be so excited to see one another that they want to embrace, but we want to make sure that we prohibit any physical contact in the workplace. Of course, you want to limit, any visitors from coming to the office that are not essential. And even some protocols with your vendors so that you have a safety procedure in place for them coming to the office. Perhaps limiting what days they can come so you don't have people constantly coming at all random days and hours. And then, of course, you're going to want to minimize the use of shared equipment. So to the extent that's possible, make sure everybody has their own staplers, their own pens and equipment. And when you need to have shared equipment, increase your sanitation and cleaning of those common surfaces. Which is a perfect segue into modifying your workspace. So everyone will need to take a real clear look at how your workspace is set up. Look at your floor plan and how you might go about separating some of the workers, maybe by separating workstations, moving some desks around, putting up dividers, and encouraging those that have doors on their physical offices to keep those doors closed. Those are all good ways to try to help with the social distancing in your workplace. You're going to want to reduce seating capacity in common areas. Some employers are going so far as to remove all chairs from like lobby areas and lounges where they just don't want people congregating, limiting or removing chairs from kitchens. And then with respect to the use of conference rooms, again, depending upon the size of the conference room, we would strongly suggest that you limit how many people can be in any conference room, maybe even removing the chairs. So if it's currently has 10 chairs in it and you think only 4 can be in there safely, remove 6 of those chairs. And then of course, implement some sort of sanitation of each conference room after such a group gathering like that. And that would be helpful to have those sanitation stations, whether it be some Purell on the wall, some wipes all over the place. Certainly want to make sure that you have wipes available for employees to wipe down common areas, whether that be refrigerators or coffee machines or copiers, things like that. Having supplies around for your employees to help clean up after themselves, both before and after use of such equipment, will be very helpful to you. Upgrading your teleconferencing technology. So not every employee has a computer, maybe with a camera on it. So you may need to purchase some new cameras or maybe some headsets with some speakers to help your employees be able to enhance their ability to participate in video conferencing. You should also consider even the air quality in your particular workspace. This can be a little bit more challenging. You might want to speak with your landlord or your maintenance management company to see what steps they're taking or ask them to take certain steps. And then of course, maybe just requesting the minimal of changing air filters. We also have a number of clients that are buying air purifying systems and placing them throughout the workplace to help keep the air quality as clean as possible. And then of course, some notices and some posters. Again, this is something you would almost never do in a workplace, but in this particular situation, having constant reminders around the workplace would be very helpful, whether it be reminders about limiting access or avoiding certain areas of your workplace, reminding people to wash their hands before they use a common surface. We're really asking people to completely change how they've been operating in your workspace. So having those posters and those notices, maybe even some markings on the floor, we think will be very helpful to ensure that the success of your plan. And in that same vein, we talked a little bit already about this cleaning and disinfecting. You know, it's a little bit hard to find cleaning supplies these days, but hopefully you all have good vendors that are coming through for you. We encourage you to continue to stock up because while things are looking good now, all the experts seem to suggest that there will be spikes coming up down the line, and we don't know exactly what the winter will hold. So I encourage you all to plan accordingly. Set up a system for cleaning your common areas. I don't know that it's sufficient at this juncture to continue to have just, you know, either a daily or a weekly cleaning service come through. You may need to have something much more regular. We have some clients that are actually hiring people to come in that will literally just go from one area to the other all day long and just constantly wipe down all the common surface areas. That might be a little overkill for your particular environments, but we do encourage you to set up a regular protocol for cleaning common areas on a regular basis, perhaps multiple times in a given day. And then of course we want to encourage employees to be part of that process and to explain to them what your expectations are. Creating a screening protocol. I'm sure you've all been considering this as well. There's been a lot of discussion, and perhaps you've even seen some temperature checks being conducted on TV at big plants and such. There's a lot of pros and cons out there as far as how does one go about safely screening employees and customers and such coming to your workplace. It's not a one size fits all. I really do think you have to know your industry, know your employees, and figure out a system that works best for you. We do encourage you though to try to implement some form of screening because we do think that right now we have to carefully monitor all people that are coming and going in the workplace. Temperature checks can be a good resource, but they do present other complications. Certainly not everybody that has COVID-19 suffers a high fever, and there are people that have fevers that don't have COVID-19. So it's not a black and white issue. Plus also you have to deal with the training of having someone take the temperatures, where you're gonna take them. It has to be done in a private way. You have to maintain confidentiality of the information. Once somebody's already at the workplace, and if they had 104 fever, and they're standing in line with 5 of your other employees, some would question whether or not it's already too late at that point. So there's a lot of different considerations. You can certainly hire a vendor to come in to help you with the pre-screening protocol. There's a lot of nurses and nursing aides that are being hired these days for these purposes. Or you might want to consider just a health questionnaire. And some of our clients are emailing these health questionnaires to their employees to be completed before they even return to the workplace. They're having them answer the very basic questions relating to the symptoms that have been identified by the CDC. And they're asking their employees to take their temperature on a daily basis and to report whether or not it exceeds 100.4. And then to email those responses by a certain time before they arrive each morning. And that enables the individual that's designated to receive those responses to evaluate any employees that answered yes to any of those questions and how best to proceed. So that's another way of doing it. Certainly important to keep in mind confidentiality and privacy concerns, no matter what screening protocol that you implement, and take safeguards to be very careful about how you maintain that information and who has access to it. Controlling the exposure. So in addition to having that plan in place and all the social distancing measures and sanitation protocols that we just reviewed, it's important that should you have an employee that either tests positive, is exposed to someone that tested positive, or begins to have their own symptoms that have been identified with COVID-19, that they know what to do. Who are they going to call? Who are they going to email? You need to have some sort of protocol in place so that an employee knows how to handle that situation, make sure that the employee is educated about what those obligations are, and then of course to require that employee to stay home. Each one of those situations can be very significant even someone that's been exposed to someone with COVID-19 that doesn't even have any symptoms yet. It would be advisable to potentially still have that employee quarantine themselves for a period of a few days at minimum, if not 14. Once you're on notice that you have an employee that is tested positive or is exhibiting such symptoms, you'll want to take some measures to clean and disinfect that particular employee's workspace, as well as any common areas that that individual may have had contact with. And then you're going to want to make sure that you evaluate whether or not that particular individual is entitled to any leave benefits. And there are a lot of different laws that have new ones as well as old ones, and Paola will mention them to you a little bit later, that may provide this employee with certain benefits for some paid time off. So you're going to need to evaluate each of those circumstances individually and then provide information to that affected individual about those benefits. Next slide. And in addition, you'll want to notify any other employees in your workspace that may have potentially been exposed to that individual. It is not appropriate to disclose the identity of the employee to others in your workplace. You simply will want to figure out which 5 employees may have been working that same shift or who work on that same floor or may have attended the same meeting together the day before, and let them know that they may have been in contact with someone that has either tested positive or is exhibiting symptoms. Similarly, you'll want to establish some sort of protocol for individuals to return to the workplace. So once someone is out, it is permissible to require a doctor's note that authorizes them to return to the workplace. It's also a good idea to, maintain some contact with employees while they're out quarantining, just to check and see on their progress. Next slide. And then the last slide that I have for you today is about responding to accommodation requests. So this is another important aspect of what your future will hold, because we anticipate that there will be a significant increase in the type of accommodation requests that employers are going to be getting. It's so important that everyone understand that you have an affirmative obligation under both state and federal law to engage in what's referred to as an interactive process. And all that means is to make sure that you have sufficient communication and dialogue with the employee to ensure that you fully understand the need and the reason for the accommodation being requested. All government agencies are strongly encouraging employers to be as flexible as possible to accommodate employees with certain needs. It doesn't mean that you have to completely give in to whatever every employee asks of you. You just have to provide some sort of accommodation to the extent you're able, and it does not impose an undue hardship that addresses the employee's concerns. So as long as you address the employee's concerns, that is adequate, even if it's in a slightly different manner than is being requested by the particular employee. Work from home accommodations, I can tell you, I've been practicing law for over 20 years, and I've had a lot of clients over the time tell me, working from home is not an accommodation we can live with. We need the person in the office. However, it is super important that we recognize that over the last few months, we've all learned that far more employees are able to do their job at home than maybe some of us had initially contemplated. So I wouldn't be so quick to refuse to allow people the accommodation of working from home. And then lastly, we recognize that there are some additional risks and considerations with respect to employees that have to utilize public transportation. However, it's important that you figure out how you want to address that, or if you can even address that. Some people we know are trying to arrange alternative ways of getting their employees to their workplaces, but that can be very costly. It's not an option for every employer. And it doesn't necessarily guarantee the safety of that individual, because even if in a car service or in a smaller van with just employees of your workplace, the virus can be transmitted. So that's the end of my part of the presentation. Dale, Paola is going to go next. I just want to make sure you want us to proceed in that way, or did you want to pause for some questions first? Oh, you're on mute, Dale.
There was one question about masks. I know, and I had answered, I said the governor is encouraging people, but are the masks required in the workplace, inside the workplace?
I have not seen anything that affirmatively mandates the wearing of masks. However, they are so strongly encouraged. And with respect to maintaining a safe workplace, it's such a simple thing that everyone can do that I'm not comfortable suggesting that anyone not have their employees wear masks in common areas. To the extent that people have, private offices and they're able to close their door, certainly once they're in their office and the door is closed and they'd like to, take off their mask, I think that that's fair and safe. If you have your employees very spread apart in a workplace, I also think that there's a possibility of maybe not wearing it for the entire, perhaps 8-hour, shift of one's day. I know that that can be very difficult, but we do believe that the guidance is strongly encouraging, both from a government perspective as well as the CDC, that employers require employees to wear masks. That's what we're seeing as the trend.
And we have Tony Russo, our partner, the president of CIA&J. Tony, any comments about this? You're on mute.
I think you guys both hit it on the head that it's highly recommended and encouraged. And I think, Dale, you hit it on the head. If you're going to be sitting around a table and you can't be 6 feet apart, you should be having that mask on. So I think you're right on.
Perfect. And so, Paola, do you want to go next?
Sure. I'm pleased to be here with you all. Thank you, DanaLynn, for going into all those very necessary procedures that all employers need to be considering as they are starting to reopen their workspaces to the extent that they've been closed, and to the extent they have been operating. They're going to be increasing those operations and hopefully bringing them back to normal. So it really is completely necessary that you go through this evaluation and analysis before you get back into business as usual, even though we're not going to be there for quite some time. With respect to the masks, I do want to note that, as the governor issues his orders, some contemplate very specific procedures. And while perhaps an office workspace has not received that level of detail at this time, there are other workspaces that have. And so where you may have retail industries where masks are mandated. And so it's important that we're paying attention to what those executive orders are as they're issued, because each industry may have very specific requirements in place for that particular industry. I know, New York City has implemented very detailed procedures for their workspaces that are reopening, and there are a number of industries in New Jersey that also have very similar specific requirements, and masks may be one of those. So it's important that you're keeping up with the orders as they're issued to ensure that you know what the protocols are for your establishment. DanaLynn talked about communication and communicating to your employees what the expectations are. So as you prepare and evaluate what you may need or not need in your workspace or in your operations, you want to have written policies. And so you want to distribute memorandums to your employees before they're coming back to work or as they're getting back out into the field, depending what the circumstances are for your industry, and letting them know what those procedures and protocols are. Your back to work plan should include references to issues relating to the hygiene, the wearing of the masks, the schedules, and any change that needs to be implemented. And you're going to have some new policies that you need to include with respect to leaves of absences. And you're going to have some existing policies like your attendance policy, your reporting to work time policy, your time record policy. Those existing policies that you have in place, you're going to have to revise some of those too to adjust to the circumstances that we're dealing with. And again, as I indicated, you want to be mindful of these new orders that get issued on a regular basis. Keep up to date with what's happening in the world, because that's obviously going to impact what happens next in your business. If you have a business where you're regularly traveling and you need to get your salesperson overseas, obviously that might not be in place right now. You want to keep up to date, which I know you're all doing because you're trying to keep your businesses operating or get them back into operations. But make sure you're keeping in mind whatever regulatory requirements may go in hand with that, such as whatever the CDC is requiring, whatever OSHA is suggesting. And so being mindful of these new laws that are constantly coming out and have been constantly coming out over the last several months, and the fact that you may have obligations in connection with those laws. Okay, so your new policies that you may not have yet. Notification protocols. If you have employees who are required to notify you when they're going to be absent, you're going to need to prepare a policy that lets them know, hey, if you're going to be sick, if you're not feeling well, if you have been traveling for personal reasons, there are some personal travel that's still occurring, have a notification protocol in writing, distributed to your employees, letting them know that they must notify you of these circumstances so you can determine and assess whether or not you need them to quarantine, whether you need them to stay home for a few days, whatever the case may be. So it's important to have that notification protocol in writing to your employees. Similarly, with the employee screening, DanaLynn went into what your different options may be. Let them know in writing what the expectation is. Let them know in writing if there's going to be a health assessment questionnaire that they need to complete before they come to work every day, and who they need to distribute it to and how they need to distribute it. And when I say distribute it, I really mean what one individual is receiving that screening form, because we do need to maintain the confidentiality of their health information. So if you have an employee who has tested positive for COVID, and they are notifying you of that through an employee screening or separately just pursuant to your notification procedures, it's important that that information is going to one designated person who's going to maintain that confidentiality. And then we need to keep those records separate from a personnel file. They can't be maintained in the same personnel file. There should be a separate drawer or folder that's locked, and access is only provided to one person who is responsible for that information and can maintain that confidentiality of that information. You're going to want to have a new policy with respect to social distancing, and I know we've talked about that, but that's something, again, you want to put it in writing, informing employees what the expectation is, not only when they're in the workplace with co-workers, but also if there are visitors, if they're meeting with clients, what the expectation is and how they should be conducting themselves. If you're in an industry where you are going into a client's workplace or a client's home, what the expectation is there. Perhaps you need to notify those individuals what the company's expectations are in terms of minimizing other people in those locations too, and who's around and who's not around. And this way you can try to minimize the exposures that you're potentially going to have your employees subjected to. And that goes similar to your operations, right? So now we're dealing with, okay, as you're interacting with customers, as you're interacting with clients, this is how we need to handle things in order to make sure that we're maintaining safe procedures. And again, with your visitors, you want to make sure that any visitors that come into the, you want to limit actually, who's coming into the workplace. I've had a number of clients who, schools are closed, daycares are closed, they needed to come in, they needed, some are teleworking, but maybe they needed to run into the office to pick something up. And they're bringing their whole, crew with them. We need to set forth strict procedures, and we recommend that you do to the extent possible in terms of who is allowed to actually walk into the workplace. You're doing this obviously to engage in the social contract of maintaining safety and trying to minimize exposure to very communicable disease, but also you're trying to minimize the risk of liability on yourself as an entity. And so by not having these types of policies in place, you're potentially creating greater risk for yourself. While we can argue all day as to whether or not somebody should or should not have a legitimate claim against an employer for creating an environment in which they were more subject to contracting the COVID-19, whether or not that would be a successful claim is really irrelevant, because what we're concerned about here is minimizing anyone being able to bring that claim and do whatever we can possible to show that we are trying to follow all the guidelines, follow all the protocols that are out there so that we can minimize that risk of exposure of liability. Okay. And so in connection, aside from those new policies that you probably don't have in place, you're going to revise some existing policies that you do have. You need to kind of cross-reference. If you have an employee handbook, go through it and try to think about each policy and how it may need to be adjusted given the circumstances. If you don't have an employee handbook, we strongly consider that you have one put into place. And even if you don't have a formal handbook or manual, have a memorandum created that provides employees with all these policies and gives them notice of what their expectations are, what their rights are, and what they need to do to contribute to your efforts to maintaining this safe workplace. Okay. With respect to a telecommuting policy, many of you probably don't have one because you didn't have to worry about that before. Some of you may only operate with work from home employees. Whether you have a policy or not, you should look it over if you have it and revise it to make sure that we're addressing some of these issues that we're dealing with today. A number of the clients have had issues with employees who telecommute and what they expected schedule could or should be. Given the pandemic we're experiencing, the CDC, they've all recommended that you try to be flexible with your employees. So to the extent it's possible, you may want to consider allowing them to have some flexibility in their work hours throughout the day. But perhaps your business is one that needs to be operating very strictly from 9 a.m. till 5 p.m. And if that's the case, we need to let our employees know that they're expected to be available from home during those hours. And if we're not making that crystal clear in a written policy or a written protocol provided to them, you run into some gray, and it can give rise to some disgruntled employees, and it can give rise to issues with meeting expectations, and then potential legal issues with things such as overtime. If you have an employee who says they're going to be available to work from 8 a.m. till 7 p.m. and they're a non-exempt employee rather, you may have a situation where now you've just authorized working from home for over 8 hours a day and being obligated to pay them overtime for those additional hours. So it's really important that you monitor that type of requirement and what their schedules are, and letting them know what the expectation is with respect to their work hours when they're working from home. Letting them know that they need to sign in and out every time they're beginning and ending work, whether they're stopping to eat lunch or whatever the case may be. Having these types of policies in place is important. Similarly, you want to ensure that if they are teleworking, that they have the IT systems in place that are necessary to secure the company's information. So you may want to work with an IT provider in ensuring they have that set up and making it clear to them that they are to be using those secure technological devices, whether it's a computer, iPad, whatever it is, the ones that you've either provided to them or that you've approved to them, that they are not to be working separately on a home computer where the company's confidential proprietary information is now subject to exposure because it's not maintained on the company's secure systems. Okay, so that's the type of information you want to have set forth in your telecommuting policy. And that might also cross-reference into your IT policy. If you don't have one, you want to make sure you have that set up in that policy also. Your travel policy.
Paola, this is great. Now we have about 10 minutes, so I want to make sure Ami has time. So
Yes,
if
I will move through.
okay,
Thank
good.
I only have about 8 to 10 minutes to present any of materials, so we're on schedule.
Okay, I just want to make sure.
Okay, so, your travel policy, we talked about whether or not you're going to require employees to report to you when they're leaving so that you can require them to quarantine if necessary. Expense reimbursement, perhaps while they're telecommuting, they have additional expenses that they're incurring, whether it's toner, paper, whatever the case may be, a new printer. Work with them on those issues. Your attendance and overtime policies, I alluded to them in the telecommuting schedule. You need to consider them also in connection with your just general policies that you have, and making sure you're cross-referencing whatever issues you have there. For attendance purposes, if you're dealing with staggered start times, you want to make sure you're addressing whatever those new start times are. With respect to your attendance policies and notification, you want to address those policies there also. We talked about technology and confidentiality. Hygiene, DanaLynn went into detail there, and so I'm not going to get too far into it. Dress code. Perhaps you require I do think masks should be required, and maybe you want to set that forth in your dress code policy. Let's talk about leaves of absence, because this is something that has been coming up very often. There have been a number of employees who have required time off because childcares were closed. Schools were closed, they needed to stay home, they could not work. And they have protected leave now. While many of you, if you're under 50 employees, have never ever been subject to the FMLA before, you are now with respect to these types of leaves of absence that the government has authorized. So those employees who have been out because schools were closed or because childcare was closed as a result of COVID, they were entitled to protected leaves of absence, which means you had to reinstate them back into their position in order to ensure that you're complying with your obligations under the laws. And we have, information related to each of these laws on our firm's website. So I encourage you to take a look at them as to what the parameters are, what the documentation and notification parameters are. Similarly, with the New Jersey Family Leave Act, that's also protect time off. And it's important that you have policies in place letting your employees know of their rights under these laws and what the procedures and expectations are from them. What documentation do they need to provide to you? When do they need to provide it to you by? And this way you can let them know what benefits are available to them and get them started on their application or claim for benefits. It's also important to remember that your paid sick leave law obligations in New Jersey and any policy you have relating to paid time off interplays with these other leaves of absence. And, while the Department of Labor has said that you can allow employees to use their paid time off while they're taking childcare leave, that's not necessarily the case if you had a New Jersey sick leave policy, because under New Jersey sick leave law, you can't require employees to use it. But you can let them choose to use that paid sick time, but you can't necessarily require them. So it's important that you understand the interrelationship between these laws. Okay? That brings us into ensuring that all of your supervisors, everybody on board, is aware of what the obligations are of the company and what the employee's rights are. And while nobody needs to be an expert on any of these issues, it's important that they're aware of the fact that these leaves of absences and these benefits are available, and that if they receive information from any employees about these issues, that it's directed to the appropriate person, the HR rep person who is more familiar and can make sure that they do what they need to do to get the information and benefits to these employees. And in order to show that you're complying with all those obligations that you have as an employer, have the training conducted, have them sign off that they attended the training. And this way you've covered yourself, that you've done what you can to ensure employees are all aware of what their rights are and what the expectation is of the company. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and let Ami proceed into his aspect of this program.
Thank you, Paola. And thank you to Dr. Caldwell and to the Rothman Institute for inviting us to present today. I'll do my best to go quickly so we can end on schedule. My name is Ami Foger. I'm a partner in Saiber's Business Services Group. Today I'm going to speak about some contractual considerations for businesses to be aware of as the state begins to emerge from the COVID-19 shutdown. As you likely know, this past Tuesday, Governor Murphy announced the lifting of the statewide stay-at-home order. And on Monday, the state will begin entering phase 2 of the road back, which will see limited opening of restaurants, retail establishments, and certain other businesses. As we begin to emerge from the shutdown, many businesses that have relied on PPP loans and other government aid to survive for the past few months must now shift their focus from surviving the pandemic to returning to profitability. As businesses closely evaluate costs and revenue sources, particular focus will inevitably be placed on existing contractual commitments. Businesses may have long-term agreements in place with customers and vendors providing for fixed or minimum purchase or sale commitments with specific performance dates and at fixed prices. When these contracts were entered into, the idea of a months-long global shutdown was unimaginable. The disruption caused by COVID-19 was so widespread that many businesses' contractual commitments may now be difficult, if not impossible, to satisfy. This may be because supply chains have been interrupted, because of staffing shortages, increases in internal costs, complications from social distancing requirements, or a variety of other factors. Businesses across the globe are looking at contractual commitments that they can no longer reasonably satisfy and are trying to figure out what can be done. In some instances, the contract itself may provide relief. Where the agreement doesn't provide any flexibility, in certain limited circumstances, there may be statutory or common law principles that may excuse performance. The first step in any analysis is to look at the language of the agreement to see if it provides any flexibility. Price changes. Sales or service contracts may include a mechanism for changing prices. Even agreements calling for sales at a fixed price sometimes permit price changes for documented cost increases. Procedures for delayed performance. Recognizing that performance may sometimes be delayed for a variety of reasons, agreements sometimes include procedures to follow in the event that a party is unable to meet the timelines set in the contract. If those procedures are followed, a party may be able to avoid a default arising from delayed performance. On the other end of the spectrum, some contracts include time of the essence language, which would render even a minor delay as a default. Change orders. Contracts sometimes contemplate that changes may be needed and include a mechanism for a party to change one or more elements of the party's performance obligations. Early termination rights. In extreme situations, a party may want to rely on early termination rights that may exist in a contract. Even if a business does not want to exit the agreement, the presence of an early termination clause may assist the business in renegotiating key terms. Force majeure clause. These clauses, which for years have been mostly ignored as boilerplate, are now getting a tremendous amount of attention in light of the pandemic. A force majeure clause is a provision in a contract that excuses a party's failure to perform certain contractual obligations to the extent caused by certain extreme circumstances outside of the party's control. It is not a get-out-of-jail-free card. The presence of a force majeure clause may be helpful, but it depends on the language of the clause and the specific circumstances that are preventing or hindering performance. There is no standard force majeure clause. These clauses tend to vary greatly from one agreement to another. Here is a sample force majeure clause. As you can see, the clause is quite long and I'm not going to read it out loud. You can see that it excuses a party's performance or delay to perform if the failure is caused by certain extreme events that are listed in the clause. The clause requires the impacted party to provide notice to the other party and to work diligently to resume performance. The clause also permits the other party to terminate the agreement if performance is delayed by more than 90 days. If your contract has a force majeure provision that you're considering invoking, you should closely review the clause with your legal advisor. In doing so, there are a number of things to look for. First, what types of events are listed as excusing performance? For example, does the clause list a pandemic, public health emergency, government action, or quarantine? If not, is there catch-all language included in the paragraph that might apply to the current situation, such as any events beyond the party's reasonable control, or acts of God? There may be exclusions included in the force majeure provision. For example, payment obligations are often excluded from the types of commitments that may be excused as a result of a force majeure event. The idea behind that is that a party should not be excused from making timely payment for goods or services that it already received. Force majeure provisions also often include specific notice requirements. If your business is seeking to have timely performance excused, it would likely need to provide proper notice to the other party. The contract may also require that the impacted party take steps to mitigate or minimize the consequences of the force majeure and to resume performing services as quickly as possible. Finally, keep in mind that the agreement may provide the other party with a right to terminate the contract if performance is delayed for an extended period. If your contract does not include a force majeure clause or any other helpful language, there are a few legal principles that may excuse performance. Impossibility. Performance of a contractual obligation may be excused where an unexpected event renders performance impossible. For example, if an owner of a venue contracts to make that venue available for use on a certain date, but an act of government results in the venue being shut down on that date, the contracting party may be excused from the obligation since it would be impossible for it to lawfully make the venue available. The doctrine of frustration of purpose excuses performance when an unexpected event removes the party's main purpose for entering into the transaction. For example, a company that supplies food at stadiums or other venues may have a contract guaranteeing them a minimum number of events per month. Now that the state is reopening, the service provider may want to resume performing under the agreement and may claim that the venue is in breach. Even if the contract doesn't have a force majeure clause, the venue may be able to avoid a breach of the agreement. The main purpose of the contract and the basic was to have food supplied at events to venue attendees. However, all venue events are canceled for the foreseeable future because of an extreme and unexpected event. As a result, the venue may be able to avoid liability to the food provider. Finally, the doctrine of impracticability may apply in sales contracts and may excuse a party's performance if unexpected events result in an excessive and unreasonable increase in performance costs, or make performing the contract substantially more difficult, complex, or challenging. For example, imagine a distributor that signed an agreement in 2019 agreeing to supply a certain volume of PPE for a fixed price in 2020. The massive shortages resulting from the overwhelming global demand for PPE could render performance of the contract commercially impracticable. I want to stress that these principles should only be relied upon in extreme circumstances and as a last resort, as they tend to be narrowly construed by courts and are only available in very limited circumstances. If you anticipate having issues performing under your contracts, we generally recommend starting a dialogue around those issues with your contractual counterparties. Everyone has been impacted in one way or another by the pandemic, and businesses are generally anticipating some supply chain disruptions. If you begin a dialogue early, before you're behind on fulfilling your commitment, you may be able to work out a mutually agreeable amendment or modification to the agreement. When communicating with a counterparty, be careful to avoid making definitive statements that your business will not perform or that it is unable to perform. Those statements may be interpreted as an anticipatory breach of the agreement and can be used by a party to suspend performance or accelerate certain remedies. What about situations in which your business is relying on third parties fulfilling their own contractual commitments to you? In general, a similar analysis applies in this situation. First, look to the agreement to see what flexibility the other party may have. Engage in regular dialogue and communication with that party to see how they are navigating the current environment. Stay alert for signs of financial distress. Explore mutually beneficial resolution of any issues that may arise. In sale transactions, if your business has reasonable grounds for insecurity about the other party's ability to perform, your business may have a right to demand certain assurances from the other party. Finally, it may be advisable to start exploring alternative suppliers or customers if you have concerns about your existing counterparties. That concludes my portion of the presentation. I got it mostly on schedule.
No, well, good. No, good job going through. And thank you all. This is a lot of great information. Now, what's the website? You have a lot of this information. I know people have some questions, and we're at the end of time. But what's your website? It's
Saiber.com, and I believe we have a COVID resource center up there. So there's a number of resources we have and that we're continuing to populate on that site.
Okay, and again, SAIBER.com. It's in the chat box. Tony, before we go, any updates? I know you're on the governor's commission. Anything you want to share?
No, I think the three speakers covered a lot of material that you and I are on the task forces, and I guess the only thing I would say is I don't know if you guys talked about the New Jersey One Pledge. I don't know, because I
No,
had.
no, we didn't. No, we didn't. Yeah, yeah. Explain that. That's important, Tony. Yeah.
Yeah, because the governor announced this yesterday, and although he's not going to make it mandatory, I think every business is probably going to want to put this New Jersey One Pledge on their window or door. But basically, it'll say that what the employer pledges to do in order to make sure everybody stays safe, you know, employees, but also vendors, clients that visit. And it's the basic things that the speakers covered, you know, wearing masks, social distancing. But I think they're going to produce these signs and then make them available for people. I know he covered it in his press conference yesterday. The other thing, and again, I apologize. I know I stepped in when I guess DanaLynn was at the end of her talk, but the Department of Labor and Workforce Development just came out with a guidance document that's available on their website now, as far as if employees don't feel safe returning to work, what their options are, and employers. And that, I think that's an important piece of guidance that people should look at. You know, for example, you know, if an employee doesn't feel safe, the burden of proof is on that employee to prove why they don't feel safe. But then that basically allows them to collect unemployment, continue to collect unemployment if that burden of proof has been met. So.
Well, thank you. Thank you all, Tony. Thank you. We thank the Saiber team, and you know, you have their information. Please reach out to them, and we may have them back again. So take care. Have a great weekend, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.